run out. I yield back.
Thank you. I'll now recognize the gentlelady from Missouri.
I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for organizing this important hearing and caring so much about this issue, as we all do on Foreign Affairs and the Asia-Pacific Subcommittee. As co-chair of the Congressional ASEAN Caucus, I understand that Southeast Asian countries are critical U.S. partners. But I remain deeply, deeply troubled by reports of serious human rights abuses in the Philippines and Vietnam in particular, and by the ongoing genocide against Rohingya Muslims. The United States must hold its friends and allies to the same high standard it holds itself. In the Philippines, Duterte has used his war on drugs to justify rampant human rights abuses, including these what he calls extrajudicial killings, and the imprisonment of opposition figures. I am especially concerned about the plight of the indigenous peoples in the Philippines. In Mindanao, which has been under martial law since May of 2017, the Duterte administration has committed these extrajudicial illegal killings, illegal arrests, and attacks on indigenous schools set up by in partnership with NGOs. Mr. Bencosme, how can the United States work with the international community to protect indigenous peoples in the Philippines?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it's really incumbent on the United States to work with like-minded countries to raise this at the highest levels diplomatically. I think the fact that there is constant harassment of indigenous people as well as other human rights defenders in the Philippines is part of a larger trend where President Duterte sort of attacks most of his critics. Anything that is sort of not seen and aligned with his agenda, he either imposes most recently sedition charges against or tries to sort of incriminate them through the media or through various other tactics. I think the United States has a very important relationship with the Philippines, and that provides leverage for us to be able to raise these at the highest level. The fact that we just recently got an assistant secretary for East Asia. We have an ambassador who's now going to another post. We don't have an assistant secretary for DRL, are all areas where we need to have the vacancies and sort of full-time senior staff to be able to raise these issues at the highest levels.
I couldn't agree more. I understand that China is financing what they call extractive development projects, which basically means kicking people off and pillaging their land in the indigenous lands in the Philippines. Mr. Bencosme, what is China's role in shoring up the Duterte administration?
Yeah, so the Chinese and President Duterte have a schizophrenic relationship as well, in that particularly with relation to the South China Sea area that has been of intense interest of the subcommittee. What we've seen is China playing both sides of the peace process. What we've seen is China playing a role in which obviously it disregards for human rights issues in the region, and where it sort of funds a lot of these,
and pillaging their land and their minerals and the things that that the indigenous people have as assets. And
right, I mean, and so this is where President Duterte, who talks a lot about national sovereignty, is unwilling to really stand up and care about human rights or his own people inside his own country. And so it's really incumbent upon the United States to raise this legislation.
In my limited time, thank you very much. Dr. Huang.
Be careful about the types of policy solutions that we recommend. This is one of the reasons why Heritage has been very vocal in terms of advocating for the use of global Magnitsky sanctions, which would enable us to go against Hun Sen directly and other party cadres who are directly responsible for undermining democracy there.
Well, and I just want to let you know that the Cambodia Democracy Act, as you know, passed here.
Of course.
We are working it through the Senate, and we look forward to having that signed this year. So it's another tool that we can put on a despotic leader of a nation that shouldn't be there. He should put his people ahead of his own personal pleasure or wealth. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Now recognize the gentlewoman from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will continue kind of that line of questioning. You know, in the past, the U.S. has often overlooked civil rights abuses in countries when we are trying to have alliances that support our national security. And now that seems to be the case in Southeast Asia. You mentioned, Ms. Enos, about the problems in the Indo-Pacific strategy. Our strategy is getting more specific on the security aspects, and there are some economic things that have been done, but it's pretty silent on what the human rights aspects are. We have declared Vietnam as a key partner because we want their help in a free and open relationship to kind of counter the Chinese influence in the area. The Cambodian situation is maybe a little bit different, but what can we be doing, all three of you, to kind of step up our attempts to balance support for human rights with the need to counter Chinese influence? And do you think this administration is doing enough of that?
I'll take that first. So I think that the administration has made a lot of rhetorical commitments through the Indo-Pacific strategy to human rights, but we have not seen the actual strategy itself materialize. And I think that there is, not just in this administration, but in several preceding administrations, an unnatural divorce between national security and national interest priorities and human rights, when I think in reality, adopting policies that advance human rights principles have the potential to advance U.S. national interests as well. And so I think we need to do a better job of articulating what that looks like.
Right now, we haven't even seen the full report, and we don't even know who's in charge, I believe, who's responsible for articulating this kind of policy. I mean, we've seen it in Latin America, you see it in Saudi Arabia. We just don't, you're right, we haven't married the two.
He's also a founder of a film festival in Myanmar. These are all things that the civilian government is doing. And so while we need to focus on accountability for the Myanmar military, we should not take off our foot on the pedal with respect to raising human rights abuses with the civilian government as well.
Thank you very much. My time's expired, and I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for extending the privilege just to ask questions in this committee. I appreciate it.
Thank you. With that, we'll hear from the gentlelady from Virginia, and Ms. Nguyen, if I will have some questions for you. So thank you for your patience. And you may get some questions from the lady from Virginia as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to first thank Ms. Nguyen for being here today and sharing your story. I commend your strength through this incredibly difficult time, and I will continue working with Representative Porter to ensure that we see your husband's safe return. I had a number of questions related to Burma and the rampant human rights abuses occurring there and the devastating refugee crisis it has created. But I do believe that our witnesses today have given us a lot to think about on this topic, and certainly more ideas for us to pursue into the future. So I'll pivot towards the Philippines with my question. Amnesty International's 2017-18 report on the Philippines expressed concern about the, quote, deliberate, unlawful, and widespread killings of thousands of alleged drug offenders, as well as, quote, reports of increased numbers of arbitrary arrests and detention and extrajudicial executions of political activists, end quote. Human Rights Watch has also noted that in previous years it has, quote, documented the killing of numerous activist peasant leaders and labor organizers. The president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte's allies swept the Senate elections in May, and recent polls seem to show widespread approval for his policies, including detentions and extrajudicial killings of drug traffickers. Given these human rights abuses, how can the United States incentivize the Philippines to move away from these policies when they at least appear to be supported by a large portion of the population?
Thank you, Congresswoman. It is really troubling that there still remains public support for the so-called war on drugs. I think that that's still irrelevant because Philippines made a commitment to abide by international human rights obligations. And so I think a couple of things that Congress can do. First is that there is a House Resolution 233, which speaks out against Philippines' human rights abuses, particularly in the context of crackdown on human rights defenders like Senator De Lima and Maria Ressa. Second, that there was last year introduced a Philippines Human Rights Accountability Bill that is worth re-examining whether it should be reintroduced into this Congress. And there's important provisions there that look to law enforcement, what type of law enforcement assistance that we're providing to make sure that it's not complicit in the human rights abuses that is going on with the Philippines National Police. I think the fact that the extrajudicial killings has not been raised at the highest level, which starts with our own commander-in-chief, and the fact that there's been rhetoric almost mimicking the same type of drug killings domestically and sort of lauding the President Duterte, I think is extremely concerning. And so really we need to make sure that our house here domestically is in order before we have credibility in places like the Philippines.
Thank you. Would anyone else care to comment on that question? Then from a data perspective, I would ask, have there been any fluctuations? Have we witnessed any fluctuations in the popular support for Duterte as an individual, as a politician, or in his policies? And if so, are there any specific things that we can learn from those circumstances?
I think one of the things, we just came out with a report last month, and one of the main findings was that the center of gravity on the killings actually shifted when particularly police officers were changed to a different part of the Philippines. So it's important to note that we need to hold all of those who have been responsible for these killings and sort of either condemning these killings or not stopping them to account. And so really getting at the level of impunity, I think, is at the core of how we resolve this issue. Unfortunately, we haven't seen much fluctuation with respect to public opinion on this issue.
California.
I thank
It's not a
I thank the chairman and welcome to the panel. Mr. Enos, do you believe human rights is an important part of U.S. foreign policy?
Yes.
Do you believe the United States should advocate for human rights when it can?
Yes.
Should we try to be consistent in that advocacy?
Absolutely.
Do you believe that the head of state, the president, can make a vital difference in that advocacy when he uses the bully pulpit of the presidency, either overseas or from the Oval Office, for that matter, with respect to human rights?
I think that the president should be a vocal advocate for human rights.
And conversely, when the president does not take advantage of that opportunity for advocacy, could it do harm? Could it set back the cause of human rights?
I think that the entire U.S. government needs to devote significant attention toward highlighting the severe human rights violations.
I agree, but my question had to do with the head of state, because
Yes, the president-
he or she has a unique role. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Mr. Benscombe, am I pronouncing that right?
Ben Cosme.
Ben Cosme, sorry. You were talking earlier when I was here, and I had to run to a markup, so forgive me for having to run out, about the Philippines. Has the President of the United States, Ms. Ennis and I agree that the President has a bully pulpit, it's unique. Human rights is a very important part of U.S. foreign policy, and the President has a particularly, a unique role in advocacy with respect to human. He can make a big difference, or not. Has he made a big difference in the Philippines?
He's made concerning comments with respect to how drug offenders should be treated, which I think are not in line with international human rights standards.
Who has?
The President of the United States.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, the President of the Philippines, Mr. Duterte, has explicitly embraced vigilantism in the Philippines. Is that correct?
Correct.
And as a result, thousands of people have in fact been murdered, either at the hands of vigilantes or sanctioned police groups in the Philippines, allegedly for drug dealing. Is that correct?
Correct.
Without due process of law,
Correct.
without going to a court,
Correct.
without even being arrested and detained
Correct.
and charged. By the way, is that the system we have here in the United States?
No.
Is that a system you think we ought to be advocating for?
No.
So would you say that that's a good example of a human rights issue that's pretty important?
Certainly the President should be, using our own system and the laws and judicial system in place and use that as a model of what should happen.
And I want to go back to what your statement earlier now to put that in context. And so certainly President Trump spoke out about this terrible situation in the Philippines in blatant violation of the rule of law, international law, human rights, and has spoken out against it and tried to tell President Duterte we do not support that kind of behavior. Is that correct?
To this day, we have not seen any public comments from.
We have not seen it. Would it be fair, again, keeping in light of the sort of philosophical framework Ms. Ennis and I established, would it be fair to say that by not speaking up, in fact, it sadly encourages Duterte and his vigilantes to persist, if not expand, their illegal activities and their gross violations of human rights in this respect?
Every time that we don't speak out on the issue, it greenlights other abusers to continue to act with impunity.
So, with impunity. So the president went to Hanoi. Is that correct?
Correct.
Certainly he used that occasion to speak out about human rights violations, such as Michael and lots of others. In fact, 128 prisoners of conscience identified by your organization in Vietnam, increased by a third since last year. And that number has grown because of a social media crackdown by the government of Vietnam. Is that correct?
Correct.
So certainly the president used the occasion of visiting Hanoi to speak out about that.
We have not seen any public comments about the detention of prisoners of conscience or other.
You're kidding. The president did not speak out about that. Ms. Nguyen, you're shaking your head. Did you want to comment?
I agree with Francisco. I have not heard or seen, our president speak out about, human rights while he was at the summit.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I do want to simply say, I believe, and I'm very grateful for Ms. Ennis's answers, I believe human rights is a cardinal, foundational part of American foreign policy and has been since the founding of this republic. We haven't always been consistent, but we aspire to something, and the world looks to us for that advocacy. When people don't otherwise have surcease, they don't have succor, they don't have a remedy. But when the United States speaks, it carries weight, even with dictators. And when we choose to be silent or turn another eye in a different direction, there are victims, real victims, human beings who are going to suffer. And that is wrong. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Conley, and I'll comment that the most eloquent speeches for human rights are those that can be silent but have a real economic effect or geostrategic effect. And when I do the second round, we'll focus on actions the United States can take to push the Philippines, push Cambodia, and especially push Myanmar, Burma in the right direction. With that, we'll recognize the gentleman from California.